He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just picked up his backpack and stepped off the plane, quiet, confused, and alone. The flight attendant said he was making people uncomfortable, but nobody explained how. No one asked him a single question, and not one passenger stood up. He thought it would end there, just another moment where silence wins. But 7 minutes later, the plane was still on the ground. The doors stayed closed. And behind the scenes, someone with more power than anyone expected had already pulled the brakes. What happened next didn't come with yelling or headlines. It came with names, files, and a sudden pause that made the whole airline freeze. This wasn't just about a boy in seat 2A. It was about who finally decided enough was enough. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. The terminal was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that hung between early departures and busy check-ins. Jalen Rivers, 16, sat by gate 27 with his headphones around his neck and a boarding pass folded neatly in his hand. He wore a gray NASA hoodie, pressed jeans, and carried a navy backpack with a worn patch that read, Robotics Club Finalist, 2023. His shoes were clean, his voice soft when he answered the gate agent's final call. "Yes, ma'am, that's me, seat 2A. He spoke with the calmness of someone raised to respect rules, not challenge them. The agent smiled politely but didn't make eye contact. As he stepped into the aircraft, a few heads turned. An older woman in pearls looked him up and down. Her husband leaned closer to her and whispered something. Jalen didn't hear it. He just found his seat in first class, tucked his bag beneath the seat, and sat down quietly. A flight attendant passed by. Her name tag read, Tiffany Lee. She was in her early 30s, slim, sharp-faced, and wore her hair in a tight blonde braid. When she saw Jalen, her eyes narrowed for just a second before she smiled. "Good morning," she said, but her voice didn't match her face. Jalen smiled back, polite as ever. "Morning." She didn't ask if he wanted a drink, didn't ask if he was comfortable. Instead, she leaned over the seat to greet the older man behind him, laughing brightly as she handed him a glass of sparkling water and called him by name. Jalen didn't say anything. He pulled out his tablet and opened the e-book his dad had recommended. A few pages in, he felt the flight attendant brush past again, this time carrying a tray. She served everyone in the row, skipping him completely. When she turned to walk away, he lifted his hand gently. "Excuse me, may I get orange juice, please?" Tiffany didn't turn around. She just said over her shoulder, "You'll need to wait. First class has a schedule." Her voice was tight, almost annoyed. Jalen lowered his hand. He felt something shift in the air, but he didn't know what it was yet. He had boarded on time. He had followed all the rules, but somehow he still felt like he had stepped into a space where he wasn't really welcome. The plane filled slowly. More first-class passengers arrived, older, well-dressed, mostly white. They gave small nods to each other, exchanged firm handshakes, and settled into their wide leather seats. Jalen kept to himself, eyes down, fingers gently turning pages on his tablet. He could feel it, though, the glances, the slight pauses when people walked past his row. One man looked at his ticket, looked at Jalen, and then leaned toward Tiffany. She bent down to listen. Whatever he said made her nod with a tight smile. She didn't look at Jalen. She just kept walking, brushing crumbs from a tray that didn't need cleaning. Jalen glanced out the window. The sky was overcast. He didn't notice that Tiffany had returned until she stopped at his row again. Her arms were crossed this time. "I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane," she said flatly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Jalen blinked. "I'm sorry?" he asked, unsure he'd heard her right. "There's been a concern raised about your behavior," she said. "Some passengers reported that you were making them uncomfortable. We've decided it's best to remove you from this flight." Jalen's lips parted, but no words came. He looked around, confused. The man behind him was now pretending to read a newspaper. The woman across the aisle sipped her wine and avoided his eyes. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. Not to argue, just to explain. Tiffany shrugged. "We're not discussing this here. Please take your things." Her tone carried no anger, but also no care. No chance to ask questions, no space to explain. Jalen stood slowly, numb. He pulled his backpack from under the seat. As he stepped into the aisle, he could feel the eyes on his back. Not one person said a word. Not one asked if this was right. As he walked out of the cabin, the silence behind him was louder than anything he'd ever heard. Jalen stepped back into the jet bridge with a hollow feeling in his chest. The cool air from the terminal met his face, but it didn't clear the tightness pressing behind his ribs. He walked slowly, clutching the strap of his backpack, as if he'd done something wrong. Though his mind kept going over everything. He hadn't been loud. He hadn't touched anyone. He hadn't even stood up. He had just asked for orange juice. At the gate, the same woman who had scanned his boarding pass earlier looked up, startled to see him return. "Is something wrong?" she asked. They told me to get off," Jalen said, voice quiet. He didn't want to say more. He could already see how her expression changed. Concern mixed with that awkward, practiced smile that meant she wouldn't get involved. She nodded slightly and motioned for him to stand to the side. Jalen moved toward a row of chairs by the window. The terminal was still calm, the buzz of airport announcements echoing now and then. He sat down, pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it. His fingers hovered over the screen. Texting his dad didn't feel right yet. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to worry him. He was supposed to land in Washington, D.C. that afternoon. His dad had even taken off early from work to meet him. His thumb hovered a second longer before he typed, "They kicked me off. I don't know why. I'm okay." He stared at the message for a few seconds before hitting send. Behind the terminal glass, the plane was still at the gate. Jalen watched as a few bags were moved around below, and a fuel truck pulled up. He noticed Tiffany Lee step outside the cabin door and speak to one of the ground crew. She laughed about something. Then she glanced up just for a second, and her eyes landed on Jalen through the glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave him off. She just turned and walked back inside. Jalen leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. For the first time, he felt something that wasn't confusion or embarrassment. It was quiet, steady anger, still buried under his ribs, but growing. Not the loud kind, not the kind that shouted or slammed doors, just the kind that stayed with you heavy and cold, because you had been treated like a problem without even raising your voice. He didn't cry. He wouldn't. But somewhere in his chest, the pieces of what happened started clicking together. The seat, the glances, the slow service, the sudden removal. He knew, even if he couldn't prove it yet. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about safety. It was about something else. Something he had been warned about, but hoped he wouldn't feel so soon. In the quiet space of the terminal, Jalen sat perfectly still, his fingers locked together in his lap. The sounds around him seemed distant, boarding announcements, the rumble of suitcase wheels, soft laughter from a nearby family. But his ears filtered most of it out. All he could hear was the last thing the flight attendant had said. "Some passengers reported that you were making them uncomfortable." He replayed those words over and over, trying to twist them into something that made sense. But they didn't. He hadn't stood. He hadn't stared. He hadn't even spoken more than 2 sentences since he boarded. His hoodie was clean. His ticket was paid for. What did uncomfortable mean? The question pressed into his thoughts like a slow needle. He thought back to that moment when Tiffany had passed him by, when she smiled wide at the man behind him, calling him Mr. Holcomb, like he was a regular. That same smile hadn't been offered to Jalen. Not even a full sentence had. Just the dismissive "first class has a schedule," like he wasn't meant to be there. A part of him wondered, was it the hoodie? Did I look too casual? Was I supposed to speak differently, smile more, not wear headphones? His chest tightened. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But somehow he still felt like he had. His phone buzzed gently in his palm. "Dad, what happened? Where are you?" Jalen hesitated. He didn't want to make his father angry, not because he feared him, but because he knew the kind of anger that brewed in his father wasn't loud either. It was sharp. It had weight. And when it came, it didn't come for show. It came for change. "Jalen, they said people were uncomfortable, but I didn't do anything. Just sitting quiet, first class." The typing dots on the screen blinked, then disappeared, then returned again, then paused. Jalen waited, his stomach tight. When the reply finally came, it was short. "Dad, sit tight. Don't speak to anyone else. I'm handling it." That was all. 6 words. But Jalen knew exactly what it meant. It didn't mean there would be yelling. It didn't mean someone was going to come storming through the terminal. It meant there was something happening already, somewhere, far beyond the gate, in a room Jalen couldn't see, involving people who didn't wear flight attendant uniforms or carry serving trays. He looked back at the plane. It was still there, still parked. The jet bridge hadn't moved. But the feeling had changed. Passengers had finished boarding. Everything should have been pushing toward takeoff by now. And yet, nothing was moving. Across the window, Jalen saw Tiffany again, this time standing near the cockpit door, holding a tablet, talking with the captain. Her voice was animated, her hands moving. She wasn't smiling now. The captain looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the front of the cabin, toward the terminal. Jalen didn't need to hear what they were saying. Something in her expression said she knew the calm she'd expected was no longer guaranteed. For the first time, he noticed her shoulders weren't as relaxed. Her stance wasn't as confident. And Jalen, sitting alone, kicked out of a seat he had paid for, felt something shift inside him. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was the first breath that didn't feel like a lump in his throat. Not because someone was defending him, but because, somewhere, without needing to raise a voice, something had started to move back in his direction. Jalen leaned forward in the chair, elbows resting on his knees, phone still in his hand. His screen had gone dark, but he didn't press the button to wake it. He just stared at the faint reflection of his face. He looked the same brown eyes, same quiet expression, same careful stillness his father had taught him to keep in uncomfortable spaces. But inside, his thoughts were storming. The words still circled his head like flies he couldn't swat. "You've made other passengers uncomfortable." He tried to measure himself against those words. Was it his posture? Was he sitting wrong? Was it because he didn't talk to anyone? Was it because he was in first class and didn't look like someone who belonged there? A part of him, small but sharp, whispered the answer he didn't want to admit. It was because of who he was and how he looked. Jalen had always known that line existed. His dad had told him about it many times. "You'll do the same things as your classmates, son, but people may not see you the same. You'll have to carry yourself steady, calm, even when it isn't fair. Especially when it isn't fair." At school, Jalen had followed the rules, stayed polite, worked hard, kept quiet when others joked too freely about things that didn't sit right. But this was something else. This was being removed, being told to leave, without cause, in front of strangers who had looked at him like he was never meant to be there in the first place. And nobody, not one person, had stood up to say, "Wait, that's not right." That, more than anything, sat heavy in his chest. Across the glass, the plane was still at the gate, still not moving. That wasn't normal. Something was wrong, or maybe something was finally right. Jalen finally pressed his phone's side button and woke the screen. No new messages yet, no updates. But his father's last text echoed louder than anything else now. "I'm handling it." His father, Dale Rivers, wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice in public. He didn't wear flashy suits or speak in big crowds, but Jalen had seen him in rooms full of powerful people and watched them grow silent when he started speaking. Dale had been flying planes before some of those people had even graduated college. He'd served, he'd led, and now he worked in a building where airspace decisions were made every hour that affected thousands of flights a day. Jalen thought about the last time his dad had given him the talk, not about birds and bees, but the other one, the one black fathers gave their sons before they went out into the world. You don't raise your voice on a plane. You don't argue. You don't try to explain too much. You stay calm. You walk away if you have to. I'll handle it later, but you don't let them trap you in a scene. Jalen had followed that advice today without even realizing it. And now that silence he kept was holding weight. Not guilt, evidence. Just then, his phone buzzed again. A single notification from an unknown number. You may notice Flight 632 is still at the gate. Remain seated. Do not speak with media. I'll brief you soon. He knew without asking. It came from one of his father's assistants. Jalen looked up slowly and noticed that Tiffany was no longer visible through the aircraft windows. A different attendant was moving through the aisle, and the cockpit door was now open. A uniformed airport staffer had stepped inside. The kind that didn't deal with food or drinks. The kind that wore badges and carried clipboards. For the first time since being removed, Jalen felt the smallest sliver of control returning, not in the form of shouting or demanding, but in the absence of movement. The stillness of that aircraft, fully boarded, doors closed, and not moving, meant something. It meant someone had stopped the machine. And deep down, Jalen knew that someone was his dad. The clock on the wall behind the gate desk ticked steadily. Its sound too faint to be heard, but somehow Jalen felt every passing minute stretch longer than it should. He had been sitting in the same chair for what felt like an hour. But when he glanced at his phone, only 20 minutes had passed. The plane was still at the gate. No taxiing, no movement. The jet bridge still attached. Something was definitely happening. And not the usual kind of airline delay. There were no announcements, no apologetic staff walking around offering snacks. Just silence. Jalen sat back, rested his head against the wall behind him, and exhaled through his nose. His body was still, but inside, his mind was racing in circles. What if they say I caused trouble? What if they lie? What if nobody believes me? He'd been raised to trust rules, trust systems. But today, he felt the quiet weight of what it meant when a system turned its back. He thought about his dad again. Dale Rivers, a man who rarely rushed his words. He always said, "Timing is power. You don't waste it on yelling. You use it to move the whole board." Jalen used to roll his eyes at that stuff. Chess metaphors, power boards, quiet discipline. It had all sounded like grown-up talk. But right now, in the middle of O'Hare Airport, watching an entire plane filled with high-paying passengers sit unmoving because of a message he sent, those words felt real. More real than anything. He glanced at the boarding desk again. The gate agent, the same one who had smiled politely at him earlier, was now on a phone call. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then toward him, then down again. Her shoulders were tense. Behind the glass, things had changed too. A man in a gray FAA windbreaker had entered the plane. He wasn't in uniform, but he had that look, clipboard in hand, steady posture, eyes that scanned every detail like they'd done this 100 times before. Jalen didn't know who he was, but he knew why he was there. Inside the plane, Tiffany had reappeared. Her body language was different now. Gone was the effortless walk and fake warmth. Now her movements were smaller, less certain. She stood by the first-class curtain, arms folded, lips pressed thin. She looked toward the front galley, then toward the back, like she couldn't decide where to stand. Jalen caught a glimpse of her speaking to another flight attendant. He couldn't hear the words, but he could tell it wasn't a friendly conversation. His chest tightened again, but it wasn't fear this time. It was pressure. Something between unease and anticipation. He had never wanted any of this. He just wanted to see his dad, fly without being noticed, sit quietly, maybe read. But now, because of how people felt around him, he had become a disruption. Not because of anything he said or did, but because of how he looked sitting in a seat he had every right to. And now they were scrambling, because someone had decided this time it wouldn't be brushed off. Not like the last time it happened to someone else. not with his father on the other end of a message. The ache in Jalen's stomach hadn't gone away, but it had changed. It wasn't the fear of being punished anymore. It was the slow, steady grief of recognizing that sometimes silence wasn't safety. It was exposure. And even when you followed every rule, spoke gently, smiled politely, you could still be seen as a threat. But for the first time in his life, that realization wasn't making him fold inward. It was making him sharper. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his dad himself. "Dad, flight is grounded. FAA compliance team is on site. Do not speak to anyone unless I say so. Stay where you are." Jalen read the message 3 times, not because he didn't understand it, but because it confirmed what he was starting to feel. His father hadn't just heard his message. He had pulled a lever, one that few people even knew existed, one that didn't come with sirens or headlines, but with silence. The kind of silence that made an airline freeze a fully boarded plane. The kind of silence that made powerful people pause before taking another step. And suddenly, Jalen understood something new. Sometimes the people who don't raise their voices are the ones with the most dangerous reach. And this time, he wasn't the problem. He was the reason the problem couldn't be hidden. The hum of the terminal's fluorescent lights faded beneath the weight of Jalen's thoughts. People passed in front of him, families juggling strollers, businessmen on their phones, a couple arguing quietly about boarding zones, but they all blurred into the background. His world had shrunk to that one row of seats, the silent plane outside the glass, and the phone resting in his palm. He turned the screen off and sat still. His fingers pressed against the back of the phone as if holding it too tightly would keep the weight of everything from falling on him. He had never been in trouble before. Not in school, not on a trip, not anywhere. He was the kind of kid who teachers liked, who turned in assignments early, who held the door for older people and thanked every server. His mother used to say he had a kind face. She died 3 years ago. His dad had picked up the rest, raising Jalen, teaching him how to read people, how to hold in the anger until it became action. Still, no part of him had expected this. It wasn't just about being kicked off. That part had happened fast, like ripping a page from a book. It was everything after. How nobody had spoken up. How Tiffany hadn't even offered a real reason. How the other passengers didn't look surprised. Like they had already written the story in their heads the moment he sat down. Like a teenager in a hoodie couldn't possibly have a real reason to be in seat 2A. Like they were waiting for him to do something wrong. And when he didn't, they called it a feeling. That word, uncomfortable, sat with him now like a thorn beneath his skin. It was the kind of word that didn't point fingers, didn't scream slurs, didn't leave bruises. But it stuck. It clung to people like him. It walked beside them into classrooms, job interviews, hotel lobbies, and airport gates. It was clean, silent, and poisonous. Jalen's leg bounced restlessly. He wasn't sure when it had started. He pressed his hand against his knee to stop it, but the tension didn't go away. He needed to do something, say something, but his father's voice was in his head again, calm and exact. When you're being watched, you act like you're already on the record. The record. Jalen's eyes drifted back to the plane. He noticed 2 things at once. First, the FAA agent had come back out of the aircraft and was now speaking to someone in a black blazer with an earpiece. They weren't airline staff, corporate maybe, or someone higher. Their expressions were flat, serious, no one was laughing. Second, Tiffany was gone. She was no longer pacing between the aisles. She wasn't pouring drinks or passing out menus. She wasn't anywhere near the windows. And Jalen had the strangest feeling that she wasn't hiding. She was being kept away from view. Something had shifted. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a longer message. Dad. FAA filed official hold. Crew is being interviewed. You're not the only complaint on file. Sit tight. Jalen stared at the text. Not the only complaint? That detail hit him harder than he expected. Somewhere in the mix of shame and confusion, he'd convinced himself that maybe it was personal. Maybe he had done something subtle that came off wrong. Maybe he'd looked too serious. Maybe he should have smiled more. But now he knew he wasn't alone. Tiffany had done this before. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last, unless someone finally made it stick. Jalen leaned back, suddenly exhausted. His head rested against the wall again, and his eyes closed for a few seconds. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Not from panic, from pressure. This wasn't just about him now. It was about everyone who had been asked to leave without ever raising their voice. Everyone who got that same shrug, that same blank stare, that same maybe next time you'll fit in better tone. And even though he didn't ask for it, didn't want this spotlight, he realized something. He was now part of the record, and whatever came next, they wouldn't be able to erase him. The air inside the terminal felt heavier now, though the temperature hadn't changed. It was the kind of weight that came when people started realizing something had gone wrong, but didn't know how to ask about it. A tension just thick enough to catch in your throat. Jalen could feel it in the way the gate agents spoke more quietly, how their eyes flicked to the plane more often than necessary. He noticed one of them gently hang up a call, then walk to the podium without making an announcement. She picked up the intercom, held it for a second, then set it back down, as if deciding against saying anything at all. He kept watching. Out the window, a third figure had now joined the small group outside the aircraft. A woman in a tailored gray suit, sharp bob haircut, an expression that didn't move. Her shoes made precise steps across the tarmac. She shook hands with the FAA agent but didn't smile. They spoke for a moment, then both entered the plane. Jalen straightened a little. The edges of everything were beginning to come into focus. His removal had triggered something far beyond a gate-level decision. This wasn't just about one flight or one seat anymore. The presence of the FAA was one thing, but when legal counsel showed up, that's when stories stopped being ignored and started being recorded. He looked down at his hands. They were resting on his lap, fingers curled slightly into his jeans. He noticed his nails had small half-moons of tension dirt beneath them. He hadn't even realized he'd been clenching his fists earlier. A wave of embarrassment rolled through him, not from anything he had done, but from how deeply all of this had wormed into his body without him realizing. He unclenched his fists and sat up straighter. There was still that voice in his head, the one that sounded too much like his dad. You're not weak, but don't let pride cloud clarity. Don't let their silence write your story for you. But another voice was there too. His own. The part of him that had never been tested like this before. It asked questions he couldn't answer. What if they twist it? What if they say I was aggressive? What if there's no camera angle that shows I was calm? What if someone lies and I can't prove the truth? He hated those questions, but he knew they were real because when you looked like him, being right wasn't always enough. You had to prove it, and then prove it again. And sometimes that still didn't matter. His phone buzzed again, and this time he startled. He hadn't realized how tightly he was wound. The message was from his dad again, short but firmer. Dad, you'll be asked for a statement later. Do not speak until I'm on the call. I've escalated. That word, escalated, meant something. In his father's world, it didn't mean yelling or threats. It meant levers, protocols, internal reviews that couldn't be dismissed with a shrug. It meant chain reactions that didn't stop until someone answered for what happened. And suddenly, Jalen understood something he hadn't before. His dad wasn't just reacting to this moment. He was drawing a line, maybe for himself, maybe for his son, but definitely for all the quiet stories that had never been written down. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed another change. A pair of uniformed staff, security this time, approached the gate and stood off to the side. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just present. A few nearby passengers started to whisper. One woman leaned toward her husband, eyes flicking from the security staff to the windowed view of the plane. Jalen didn't need to hear what she said. He knew the look. Confusion mixed with curiosity and the kind of entitlement that always demanded answers, even when it had never asked questions. And just like that, a shift passed through the waiting area. Suddenly, people were noticing him. the kid sitting quietly alone near gate 27, the one who hadn't boarded, the one who looked calm, but too calm for someone who had been kicked off a flight. Someone's voice, too loud, echoed across the seating area. "What's going on with this flight? Why haven't we left yet?" Jalen looked straight ahead. He didn't blink. He didn't move. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of being seen. Because now, every second that passed, someone else was starting to ask the same questions he had asked when he was told to leave. The difference? Now, they were uncomfortable. And he was still sitting in the same chair. Still waiting. Still watching. Only this time the silence was working in his favor. The boarding area had changed. Not just in movement, but in atmosphere. It wasn't loud, not yet. But the murmurs were starting to spread like water seeping through thin cracks. Whispers curled around rows of leather seats between rustling newspapers and clinking coffee cups. People were getting restless. The flight was supposed to have taken off by now. But it hadn't even pushed back from the gate. And that, more than anything, was making passengers look up from their screens. Jalen could feel it, the shift. He was no longer invisible, not in the way he had been when he first walked onto the plane, eyes skimming over him like he didn't belong. Now the attention had returned, but with a different weight. Not the quiet rejection of an assumed outsider, but the alert gaze reserved for the one thing people can't stand at an airport: uncertainty. He remained seated in the same chair, back straight now, his hands resting calmly on his backpack, not clenching anymore. But every nerve in his body was tight, like wires stretched just before they snap, not from fear, from waiting, from the knowledge that everything was happening just beyond his reach and yet somehow still about him. He kept his face unreadable, remembering his dad's advice. Let them read silence. They'll fill it with their own guilt. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a new man enter the scene. Older, late 50s maybe, sharp dark suit, smooth walk, the kind of man who didn't travel through security checkpoints. He walked around them. He carried a leather folder and an authority that didn't need announcing. He nodded once to the uniformed staff standing by the gate, then motioned to the lead flight attendant who had remained outside. A quiet exchange followed. The woman's posture tightened. The suited man didn't raise his voice, didn't frown. He just looked at her, and somehow that was enough. Jalen's phone buzzed again. Dad. Stratus Regional Director just arrived. Confirmed FAA suspension for crew lead pending interview. You'll hear from me soon. He stared at the screen, reading the message slowly. Then again. Then once more. Suspension. Not a warning. Not a reminder. Not a gentle coaching note. Suspension. It felt strange. Not good, not bad. Just unreal. Somewhere beneath the dull ache in his chest and the creeping exhaustion in his arms, he realized what had just happened. Someone believed him. Not just because of who he was, but because of what had happened. Because it was finally being documented. But even that small sense of justice didn't come without complication. Part of him still felt unsure, guilty even. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because of the fallout. Because of what this might do to that flight attendant, to the crew, to the passengers who just wanted to get where they were going. He didn't want any of this. He didn't want to be the kid people stared at or whispered about. He just wanted to fly, quietly, like everyone else. And yet, here he was, at the center of something that had begun with a shrug and a lie. He took a slow breath, then another. The familiar voice of self-doubt tried to creep in. What if I'm overreacting? What if this gets bigger than it should? But the voice was weaker now. It had lost its power somewhere between the moment he stepped off the plane and the moment his father said, "They've been warned, they didn't listen. Now they will." Outside the window, the plane door was finally opened. Not for passengers to leave, not yet, but for accountability to enter. Two figures emerged. One was the same FAA agent from earlier. The other was Tiffany. She didn't look the same. The poise was gone. The casual authority, the unearned confidence had dissolved. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if trying to shrink inside her own uniform. She spoke to the agent, nodding at intervals. Once, she gestured toward the plane, then pointed behind her, likely toward where Jalen had been seated. Then something happened that made Jalen sit up straighter. Tiffany turned her head toward the terminal, and her eyes met his. It wasn't long, a second, maybe less, but it was long enough. He didn't glare, didn't flinch. He just looked at her, steady and plain, like someone who wasn't scared anymore, like someone who had endured the silence, and had found the truth standing beside him now, not behind him. She looked away first. That mattered more than he expected. He didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of victory, only a grounded, steady awareness that this wasn't about punishing someone. It was about making sure this didn't happen again, to anyone who didn't know how to speak up, or worse, to someone who thought staying quiet meant staying safe. Behind him, another announcement echoed through the terminal. Flight 632 to Washington, D.C. is experiencing a delay. We appreciate your patience. But Jalen already knew. That delay wasn't just mechanical, it was deliberate. The machine had been stopped on purpose, because silence wasn't going to protect anyone anymore. And this time, the pause belonged to him. Jalen shifted slightly in his seat, finally feeling the pressure in his spine from sitting upright for too long. He eased back into the plastic chair, arms resting on his thighs, fingers tapping lightly, nervously, on the strap of his backpack. His body was still, but inside he was unraveling thread by thread. The room around him felt too quiet now, even though voices buzzed at the gate, footsteps echoed across the floor, and the occasional sharp ding of an intercom broke through the air. None of it touched him. He was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. There was a part of him that wanted to pull his hood over his head, curl into himself, disappear, pretend it hadn't happened, pretend he hadn't heard Tiffany's words, hadn't felt every silent gaze, hadn't seen the glint of dismissal in her eyes as she told him to get off his flight. He'd followed every rule, worn clean clothes, spoken softly, booked a seat, not asked for one. And still the message had been loud and clear. You don't belong here. That kind of message didn't need yelling. It lived in small things, in skipped drink orders, in careful glances, in the way people pretended not to see. It was made of dismissals too smooth to call out loud, too slippery to prove. But today, something unusual had happened. Someone had called it out anyway. His father had always told him to be careful, to be patient, to never act out. You don't have the same room for mistakes as others, he'd said more than once. Not as a warning, but as truth. Jalen had followed that advice. And still, he'd been pushed off a plane for existing quietly in a space not meant to see him. But now, sitting at gate 27, with that plane frozen behind the glass, with officials pacing its aisles and passengers fidgeting in their seats, Jalen realized something else. The silence they counted on had worked until today. Because this time, silence had passed hands. It no longer belonged to the ones who watched and said nothing. Now it belonged to him. The gate agent approached slowly, hesitantly, like someone stepping through glass. She had a clipboard in her hands, but it was clear she wasn't here to hand him anything. Her smile was cautious. "Hi," she said softly, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. Mr. Rivers, they've asked if you can remain here a little longer. Someone will be coming to speak with you directly. Just a quick chat. Not an interrogation or anything, just they're asking." Jalen nodded once. He didn't trust his voice yet. The woman waited, maybe for him to say something, maybe for him to ask a question. But he didn't. He just held her gaze long enough for her to glance down and nod awkwardly. "I'll let them know. Thank you." She walked off. Her voice had carried a different tone than before. It wasn't the clipped, polite service voice. It was cautious now, measured, the kind people used when they were afraid they had been too casual with someone who mattered more than they thought. That was the irony. He hadn't changed. He hadn't gained new power. He had always been exactly who he was, smart, respectful, prepared. The only thing that had shifted was who was listening. His thoughts drifted to the other passengers again. He wondered what they were thinking now. Did any of them regret watching him leave in silence? Did anyone replay the moment in their head, the boy being asked to step off, the excuse that didn't sound right, the way no one questioned it? He would never know. That's how things like this usually went. The people who stood by moved on. The people who were removed didn't forget. But this time, someone had remembered. Someone had been listening from a different building with access to different tools and had chosen to act, not out of anger, but out of principle. His dad hadn't stormed into the airport. He hadn't shouted on the phone. He had simply pressed the right buttons, pulled the right levers. He had made the system freeze on behalf of his son. And Jalen knew. It wasn't just for him. It was for every kid who wouldn't have a father with that kind of reach. For the ones who had walked off planes quietly, heads down, thinking maybe I did something wrong, when the truth was, they had done nothing at all. The heaviness returned to his chest, but it wasn't grief this time. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to understanding. He wasn't just in the middle of a personal problem anymore. He was inside the machinery now, seeing where the gears jammed, feeling what it took to make them stop. And from where he sat for the first time, he wasn't the one being moved. He was the one who had made them pause. Jalen leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were pale. He wasn't cold, but he felt a chill somewhere deeper, in the space where fear lived just under the ribs, quiet and tight. His mind wasn't spinning anymore. It had settled into something heavier now. Not panic, not shock. Something slower. Awareness. He was beginning to understand the moment he was in. Not just what was happening to him, but what he was now inside of. The gate had quieted again. Whatever noise had built earlier had been swallowed by the presence of officials, the unusual standstill of the plane, and the clear discomfort in the air. People were still watching him. He could feel it, but not with the same casual dismissal as before. It had changed. Some looked with curiosity, others with guarded judgment. A few avoided his eyes altogether. He could guess what they were thinking. Is this about racism? Did something happen? Why haven't we taken off yet? But no one asked him. No one came close. He sat alone, just like before. Only this time he wasn't invisible. That should have felt like a win. But it didn't. Because he didn't want to be seen under these conditions. He didn't want attention because of someone else's mistake. He didn't want pity, or worse, suspicion disguised as concern. He just wanted to be a teenager on his way to see his father. A kid with a boarding pass. A kid with a right to be in seat 2A. And yet every quiet second reminded him that being right wasn't the same as being allowed. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady the beat in his chest. It wasn't racing, not anymore. But it was steady, like a drum. Across the terminal, the woman in the gray suit reappeared, the corporate one. She stepped off the plane, her face unreadable. Her heels clicked lightly on the floor as she walked straight to the gate podium. There, she exchanged a few quiet words with the agent. Then, her eyes moved deliberately toward Jalen, and this time, she didn't look away. She walked toward him. Each step was calm, practiced. Her folder was tucked neatly under her arm. Her eyes never dropped, not to her phone, not to her feet. Jalen stood, not out of respect, though he was respectful, but because he didn't want to meet this part of the moment sitting down. "Mr. Rivers?" she asked gently. "Yes. I'm Dana Kessler, Corporate Affairs for Stratus. We'd like to offer you a private room just to speak briefly. We want to hear from you directly." She paused, her tone very controlled. "With your permission, of course." Jalen didn't move at first. The word "we" hung in the air. He wondered who "we" was. Corporate legal? Public relations? Both? He nodded once. "Am I required to say anything?" "No," Dana replied quickly. "You're not under investigation. We're conducting an internal review of the flight crew. Your father has made the situation very clear." There it was. Not threats, not demands, just clear. Jalen grabbed his backpack and followed her. They walked through a quiet hallway off the gate into a glass-walled conference room tucked near the operations area. It wasn't fancy, just white walls, a long table, a pitcher of water, and a single folder on the table waiting for her return. She gestured for him to sit. He did, but he didn't relax. "Would you like someone present with you?" Dana asked, taking the seat across from him. "I was told my dad would be on the call," Jalen said. His voice didn't waver, but it sat low in his throat. "He will be." She nodded. "We're just waiting for confirmation that the FAA representative has joined. Then we'll begin." Jalen looked down at his hands again. He noticed a small ink smudge near his thumb. He had used a pen this morning to sign the check-in form. Funny how something so small could ground him. His heart was beating in rhythm again. Not fast, not slow, just steady. He wasn't sure what he would be asked. He wasn't sure if his words would matter in the long run. But he knew this much. He wouldn't let them bend his silence into submission. Not after everything that had happened. Not after watching an entire plane of people accept his removal without a word. Not after sitting alone and wondering, for the first time in his life, if his presence was a problem to be solved. He heard a soft tone from the speaker on the table. Dana tapped a small tablet beside her. "We're connected," she said. Then she turned the mic on. "Mr. Rivers," came a voice through the speaker, warm but firm. It wasn't his father. It was someone else. "We understand this has been difficult. We're here to hear from you directly, in your own words. You can speak freely. There is no rush." Jalen looked at the mic. His throat tightened, but not with fear. He sat up straighter, cleared his voice, and began to speak. Jalen took a quiet breath, the kind that filled the chest but didn't make the shoulders rise, like he'd practiced so many times before school presentations. Only this time there was no teacher waiting to nod, no classmates pretending to listen. Just a corporate room too clean to feel real. A woman across the table with a legal pad, and a lawyer's expression, and a speakerphone that echoed every pause in his voice back at him. He could feel the tension in his throat as he looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking, but they felt far away from him, like he was watching himself from just behind his shoulder. He glanced toward Dana. Her pen hovered above her notepad. She wasn't smiling. She was still, studying. That kind of stillness that wasn't meant to calm. It was meant to record. The voice on the speaker had gone silent, waiting. Jalen looked at the microphone. "I got on the plane," he said quietly. "I had a ticket. Seat 2A. My dad booked it for me." His words came slowly at first, pulled up from somewhere deep where shame and memory lived too close together. "It wasn't my first flight alone, but it was the first time I was flying first class." There was no response, just soft static. "I didn't say anything to anyone," he continued. "I had headphones in. I was reading, just waiting for takeoff. I asked for orange juice. That was the only thing I asked for." He hesitated. "The flight attendant, Tiffany, she didn't bring it. She skipped me. I waited a while, then asked again. She told me to wait. That first class had a schedule." Dana's pen finally moved. Slowly. The scratching sound was deliberate, controlled. Jalen glanced down again. The words were building faster now, no longer needing to be dragged out. "Then she came back with another flight attendant and told me I had to leave. Said I made other passengers uncomfortable. But I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't touch anyone. I didn't even stand up." He felt a small, bitter laugh try to rise in his throat. He swallowed it. "I just sat there, the same way I'm sitting here." He paused. No one interrupted. No one offered sympathy. They were letting him speak, but not feeling anything yet. He could tell. That was the part he hated most, being listened to as if his story were a data point instead of a moment that had split open something inside him. They didn't give me a reason I could respond to. Just said it wasn't up for discussion. I walked off, quietly, because I didn't want to make it worse. He felt the heat behind his eyes, but blinked quickly and held his breath until it faded. He wouldn't cry. Not because he thought it made him weak, but because he knew the room wasn't built to handle his emotion, just his explanation. I texted my dad. That's it. I didn't want to worry him, but I knew if I didn't tell him, no one would believe it even happened. He looked up. Dana was staring at him now. Her pen had stopped. Her lips were slightly parted, like she was hearing the full weight of it for the first time. He could see a shift. Small, but it was there. The voice on the speaker returned, calm and even. Did anyone from the flight crew ask you questions before asking you to leave? Jalen shook his head. No one asked me anything. No one explained what was wrong. No one gave me a chance to defend myself. They just said someone felt uncomfortable. And did you witness any behavior from passengers around you that might explain that complaint? He hesitated. A few of them looked at me weird when I boarded, like I didn't belong there. One man whispered something to the flight attendant after I sat down, but I don't know what he said. He felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. I guess I didn't need to do anything. Just being there was enough. The room fell still again. That sentence sat like a stone in the center of the table. Dana cleared her throat softly. Thank you, Jalen, she said, voice quieter now. Is there anything else you want us to know? He thought for a long second. Then he said, yeah. He looked directly at her. His eyes didn't drop this time. I've done everything I'm supposed to. I follow the rules. I speak politely. I study hard. My dad raised me to be respectful in every space, even the ones that aren't built for me. But I need you to understand. Being quiet doesn't make this easier. It just makes it easier for people to keep doing it. Dana didn't move. Her eyes held his. Jalen let the silence hang. Not because he didn't have more to say, but because that was enough. He had spoken, and for the first time today, the room didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a courtroom where no one had prepared for a witness like him. He leaned back slightly, not relaxed, but steady. And somewhere behind the speaker, a door had opened, and no one could close it now. The silence after Jalen's last words wasn't empty. It was dense. No one rushed to fill it. Not Dana. Not the voice on the speaker. Even the pen that had been moving with steady discipline now rested idle on the notepad, its tip faintly touching the page, as if waiting for the next sentence before it dared make a mark. Jalen sat back in his chair, but he wasn't relaxed. His spine was straight, eyes forward, breath measured, but inside something was trembling. Not fear. It was something harder to name. It was the exhaustion that came after courage. When the adrenaline dropped and all that was left behind was the truth, still warm in the air, and the long question of what now. The speaker crackled faintly again. Then the voice returned. Mr. Rivers, the man said more slowly this time, I want to thank you for sharing this with us. You've conducted yourself with clarity and grace under very difficult circumstances. We acknowledge that. Jalen didn't reply. Not because he was being rude, but because the word acknowledge didn't feel like enough. It sounded like paperwork, like the kind of language that filled reports to sound correct, not right. He didn't need their thanks. He needed the next part. The change. Dana glanced at her tablet again, then turned her eyes to him. This time she didn't look detached. She looked like someone doing math in her head, calculating policy, risk, and humanity all at once. I'm going to step out for a moment, she said gently. There's a call waiting from my team. You'll remain on the line with our FAA representative. Someone from our executive staff may join shortly. Jalen nodded once. Dana stood, gathered her tablet, and left without another word. The door clicked softly behind her, but the sound echoed louder in his mind than he expected. He was alone again, except for the voice in the speaker, which stayed quiet, respectfully present, and his thoughts, his constant companion since the moment Tiffany told him to get up and leave. He let his gaze wander for a moment. The glass walls of the room offered a narrow view of the tarmac. It had started to rain, thin streaks trailing down the window like veins. Planes came and went in the distance, unaffected by what had happened at Gate 27. To them, this was just another afternoon, another minor delay, another small, forgettable incident. But to Jalen, it had cracked something wide open, because he couldn't forget what it felt like, being told he was a problem. Not because of noise, not because of action, but because of presence. Because his body in a seat was enough to shift the air for someone who didn't know him, didn't speak to him, and didn't care to ask. He thought about that man, whoever had whispered to Tiffany. What had he said? Keep an eye on that one. Does he really belong here? He looks out of place. Jalen would never know. But he didn't need to, because whatever was said had been believed without question. That was the part that dug deepest, not the man's comment, but Tiffany's quickness to act on it. The decision to remove him had come too easily. No warning, no verification, just assumption wrapped in professionalism. And worst of all, no one in the cabin had stood up. Not one person. He had scanned their faces when he stood up, heart pounding, hands gripping his backpack. He remembered the way they averted their eyes, pretending to scroll through phones or stare at tray tables. He remembered the sting of that, the betrayal of silence. The kind that said, if it's not happening to me, it's not happening at all. A sharp knock pulled him back. Dana re-entered, this time accompanied by a taller man in a navy blue suit with silver trim on his collar, some kind of airline insignia. His face was composed, lips thin, jaw square. A career man, someone who'd been through public messes before. Mr. Rivers, he said with a nod. My name is Gordon Chase, Senior Director of Stratus Flight Services. Jalen didn't answer right away. He waited. Let the man speak first. I won't take too much of your time. I've just been briefed by our internal review team and FAA compliance staff. What you experienced today, what was done to you, is unacceptable. He paused. Jalen kept his face neutral. He wanted to believe him. He also knew not to fall too easily into apologies that sounded like speeches. We have placed the lead flight attendant under immediate suspension pending further review. The rest of the crew will be included in an internal audit of their conduct. We are also pulling security footage, audio recordings, and prior service complaints to build a complete picture. Jalen sat still. We're also initiating a passenger behavior review on the individual who reportedly made the complaint that led to your removal. If his actions were discriminatory or intended to provoke bias, we will take appropriate action. Jalen's hands rested on the table now, still clasped, still firm. I appreciate that, he said quietly. But that's not all this is about. Gordon nodded. No, it's not. Jalen hesitated, then added, because I'm not the first. And if this ends quietly, I won't be the last. Dana glanced at Gordon. Something passed between them. Not surprise. Acknowledgement. We've already contacted your father, Gordon said. He's requested a formal meeting with our leadership board. We'll be honoring that. Your statement today will be included in that review, and I want you to know this isn't going away. Another pause. Jalen looked down, then up again. Good, he said, because I want my seat back. Dana blinked. I'm sorry? He held her gaze now, steady. My seat. 2A. I want it back. I'm not boarding through a side door or sitting in coach or waiting on standby. I want back on that flight. Same seat. With the same confidence as anyone else. Neither of them spoke at first. Then Gordon said, Understood. And in that moment, Jalen didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just exhaled, and knew the next move was his. Jalen stood just outside the glass-walled room, staring down the terminal hallway. Everything ahead looked the same as it had earlier. The rows of gates, the muted screens with flight statuses, the slow, shuffling tide of travelers moving from one wait to another. But for him, nothing looked the same anymore. A security escort had offered to walk him back to the gate, but he'd politely declined. He didn't want to be shielded. Not anymore. He wanted to walk back as himself, visible, unbothered, unapologetic. The boy who had been removed from seat 2A for doing nothing was now walking back to take that same seat, and not a single person could stop him. Each step felt heavier than it should, like the floor beneath him understood the weight he carried. Not physical weight, but something older, shaped by silence, by history, by all the stories that had never made it past the terminal walls. Stories that ended with he said, she said, or were filed away under passenger behavior concerns and crew discretion. But this time the story had lived. This time it had been written down, spoken aloud, investigated, believed. As he approached gate 27 again, the crowd was thinner. Some passengers had been rebooked. Others had wandered off for food, their patience stretched by the unexplained delay. But the ones who remained, those who had witnessed him being asked to leave earlier, looked up as he returned, and this time they didn't look through him. Some glanced away quickly, eyes dipping in discomfort. Others met his gaze and held it, unsure what they were supposed to feel: guilt, recognition, pity. Jalen gave them nothing. He didn't need their reactions. He walked past the waiting area without hesitation and stopped in front of the boarding agent. She looked up, startled at first, but then nodded quickly, almost too eagerly. "Mr. Rivers," she said, her voice nervous but rehearsed. "You've been cleared to reboard. We apologize for the delay. Your seat has been restored." He nodded once. "Thank you." She scanned his pass without another word. The door to the jet bridge opened again, and this time he stepped through it on his own terms. As he walked the short metal hallway, the air felt different, cooler, thinner. His heart beat steadily in his chest, not from fear now, but from resolve. He wasn't walking into an apology. He wasn't returning to be welcomed back. He was returning because he had never deserved to be removed in the first place. The flight attendant waiting at the cabin door was not Tiffany. She was gone, replaced by a man with graying hair, calm eyes, and a voice that didn't carry judgment. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Rivers," he said gently, stepping aside to let Jalen pass. Jalen nodded, said nothing, and walked down the aisle. First class was quiet now. The passengers who had seen him leave earlier avoided his eyes, or looked up with a flicker of surprise. Some widened their eyes, as if unsure how or why he was back. Others looked away entirely, pretending again. But Jalen didn't need their understanding anymore. He walked to seat 2A, placed his backpack beneath the seat, and sat down. Slowly, deliberately, like it was his seat. Because it was. He rested his palms on the armrests and looked straight ahead. The leather seat cradled him with the same comfort it had offered earlier, but now it felt earned in a different way, not because he had paid for it, but because he had fought for it. Quietly, with dignity, with truth. Across the aisle, a man adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He didn't speak, but Jalen could feel his nervous energy. That used to be his job, managing the discomfort of others. But not today. Today, someone else had to sit with it. A flight attendant approached from the galley. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Jalen paused, then looked her in the eyes. "Orange juice, please." She nodded without hesitation. Right away. And then, for the first time since that morning, he leaned back in his seat, unbothered. He pulled his tablet from his backpack and opened the book he had tried to read hours ago. Outside, the engines began to hum softly. The plane had been delayed, but now it was moving forward. So was he. The plane ascended slowly through thick gray clouds, its wings steady, engines low and smooth. The soft vibration of flight filled the cabin, just enough to remind Jalen that they were no longer on the ground, no longer stalled, no longer waiting for someone else to decide what came next. He looked out the window from seat 2A. Raindrops clung to the glass at first, then peeled away as the aircraft rose above the storm. The sunlight appeared in patches, like it was deciding whether to break through. He watched the clouds shift beneath him, so far below now that they felt harmless. He rested his head lightly against the side of the seat, but he didn't close his eyes. His body was tired, but his mind was still full. too full to sleep. The tension that had filled his chest earlier had softened, but it hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape. It wasn't fear anymore, it wasn't even anger. It was something slower, deeper, something closer to awareness, and a quiet kind of grief. Not for himself, but for the things he now understood too clearly. He thought about how close it all had been to ending differently. If he hadn't texted his dad, if his father hadn't had the position he did, if this had happened on a smaller airline, or with less documentation, or on a day when people weren't watching closely, what then? Would anyone have believed him? Would he have doubted himself? Would he have sat quietly in some back room at the airport, trying to figure out how to get home, wondering if he had really done something wrong? That thought sat with him now, heavier than anything else. Because for every kid like him who did get a call answered, for every injustice that made it onto a report, there were dozens, maybe hundreds more that didn't. No phone call, no pause in flight schedules. Just a quiet ejection, followed by an even quieter forgetting. He looked down at his lap. His hands were open now, relaxed on either side of his tablet. No tension in his fingers, no pressure in his jaw. But his chest still carried the echo of that moment. The moment she'd told him to leave. The way it cut through the air like it had already been decided. The way his backpack felt heavier when he picked it up, like it carried every insult she hadn't said out loud. He thought about Tiffany, not with hate but with clarity. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't used a slur. She had smiled, professionally, and still stripped him of his place like it was procedure. That was the part that stayed with him. How easily she had done it. How easily the people around her had allowed it. How comfortable the system had been with it, until someone more powerful pressed pause. He knew this wasn't the end of something. Not really. It was a single interruption in a pattern that would try again somewhere else to repeat itself. But it was his interruption. And that mattered. For the first time, someone had written it down, listened to it, acted on it. And he had been seen. Not because he shouted, not because he protested, but because he had stood still in the storm and refused to shrink. The seatbelt sign pinged softly. The captain announced that they'd reached cruising altitude and expected smooth skies ahead. Jalen turned his face back to the window. He didn't cry, but his eyes did sting a little. Not from sadness, but from the strange release of a day that had tried to tell him who he was, and failed. He took a sip of the orange juice resting on his tray table. It was cold, slightly pulpy, just how he liked it. And for a moment, he let himself be still. Not defensive, not alert. Just still. Above the clouds, far from the gate that had pushed him out, he existed fully in his own seat, with no one asking him to move, to explain, to disappear. And in that stillness, Jalen Rivers, 16, black, brilliant, and finally heard, closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in quiet strength. Because this time, the silence belonged to him, and the sky had finally made room. If this story moved you, make sure to give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this coming soon.